King.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Grant Robertson.
That's right,
I
Mr.
nearly
Speaker.
gave you an honourable, but
That's right, Mr. Speaker. I haven't changed that much. Mr. Speaker, it was interesting that the Minister, acting on behalf of Bill English, couldn't quite get through her statement about the government's surplus/deficit without a little snigger. Because the truth is, the new language fed to government ministers by Linton Crosby is to talk about trajectory. That's the answer. It's not about actually whether you're going to get to a surplus or not. It's a little bit like Nick Smith's conceptual house. It's all about the trajectory that we're going on, despite the fact, Mr. Speaker, that as the government staggers towards the end of the financial year covered by the supplementary estimates, they stagger towards a failure for the 7th time to reach a surplus. And it's not about trajectory, Mr. Speaker, it's actually about the integrity of this government. Because before the last 2 elections, this government has told New Zealanders that there would be a surplus in 2014-15. Now, it may have been a legitimate debate for the government to have gone to the 2014 election and said, you know what, there is a range of serious social issues facing this country that mean that we can't make surplus. They could have gone there. They could have gone there and said, we've failed over the last few years to actually deal with child poverty. We've failed to invest enough in health to ensure that budgets are kept up, that people can get the basic health services they want. They could have come to New Zealanders and been honest and been upfront and said that. But they didn't, Mr. Speaker. They went to New Zealanders with their #1 economic priority to be in surplus for 2014-15. That date was there, that promise was there, and it had been there for 2 elections, and that promise has been breached, Mr. Speaker. Now, members on the other side of the House might think it's not important. They might think they can just change the language, talk about trajectories and conceptual ideas, but the reality on the ground is that they broke a promise to New Zealanders and they have failed to reach that surplus. And as they do stagger towards the end of this financial year, the year in which they promised New Zealanders there would be a surplus, they sit alongside that an economic record that the Reserve Bank Governor has now been clear is one that is struggling and staggering along. And there are members on the other side of the House who like to say, perhaps when my back is turned, Jamie Lee Ross, that I talk the economy down. Well, the reality is, this is not me, Mr. Ross. This is not me. This is the Reserve Bank Governor coming along to New Zealanders and saying there is no sign that exports are going to recover. And the government, having outsourced housing policy to the Reserve Bank, now outsources economic policy and says, well, you better sort this out as well, because we haven't got any ideas as a national government. So Graham Wheeler has to be able to say, well, I'll cut interest rates now. I'm worried about whether that's going to pour petrol on the overheated housing market in Auckland, but there's no sign of this government stimulating the economy, and he has to act. So this government has failed to deliver to New Zealanders the kind of benefits that would be expected from an economic growth rate of around 3%. In 2006, Mr. Speaker, which you might recall, the government at that time had a growth rate around about 3.5%. And it delivered a multi-billion-dollar surplus, and it had unemployment as the second lowest unemployment in the OECD. Fast forward to 2015, a similar growth rate, a deficit, 41,000 people more out of work than when National came into office, a failure to lift exports, a failure to invest in core areas like education and health to the extent that they are needed. This kind of economic growth that the government currently have is not delivering to New Zealanders across the board. And one of the reasons for that is the economic growth is built on something very soft and very shaky, and that is the recovery from the Canterbury rebuild. Now, that recovery is important for the people of Canterbury, but it's not an economic plan. It's not an economic plan. And if we remove that out of the growth figures, and then we take into account the high levels of migration, real growth per head of population's under 2% now. And that's why right around New Zealand, Mr. Speaker, People are not feeling the benefits of this growth. And in the Northland by-election, Mr Bishop, very familiar with this, the message that was given to the National Party was, don't come up here and tell us you've never had it so good. Don't come up here and say there's 3% growth, isn't it great? Well, that's right. For Chris Bishop, it was just don't come up here. But it was a message to them, to the National Party from the regions of New Zealand. And it doesn't matter if you're in Dunedin or if you're in Gisborne or if you're in Wanganui, Mr Speaker, what you will hear from New Zealanders in the regions is they're working hard, but they feel like this government has neglected them. And you take a look at the budget, the Imprest supply bill, the supplementary estimates, and you ask yourself, where is the investment in New Zealand's regions? Where is the investment in diversifying the economy away from our reliance on commodity prices? Because that's right, I will give Mr Finlayson credit for this. The wharf at Waitangi. There is the plan to turbocharge the New Zealand economy from Chris Finlayson. I understand Mr Finlayson has had a large print of himself put on the wharf design, so it will be there, so people will see his beaming face on arrival into the Waitangi Wharf in the Chatham Islands. And good on Chris Finlayson for helping the very hard-working MP Annette King achieve that long-held dream of the wharf at Waitangi. I'll tell her you said that. But that's it. That's it in terms of regional economic development from this government and in this budget. And I'll wait for one of the members on the other side of the House to get up and say, no, the regional research institutes are here. Well, this deserves a little bit of unpicking, doesn't it? The regional research institutes, up to 25 million. That up to phrase got left out when Stephen Joyce made those announcements during the budget period. And also only 3 of them. So only 3 regions in New Zealand are going to benefit. And I'll bet you they already know which regions those are. And there's going to be a lot of disappointed regions in New Zealand because that up to $25 million isn't going to stretch very far. And Mr Speaker, that is the problem, because today we saw for the 7th consecutive global dairy auction a drop in the prices, global dairy prices. That's a 55% drop since February last year, a 30% drop since March this year. And to turn that into real numbers, that's billions of dollars not present in regional New Zealand. Now, it's tough work for the farmers concerned, and some of them have got very high debt levels and will have struggles over the next 2 years. But it's also for that wider rural community. Take a small place like Opotiki in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. $30 million won't be in that community next year. $30 million in a small community like Opotiki makes a huge difference. That's jobs in the service sector. That's jobs in the community that struggles without that. And that is what is missing, Mr Speaker, from this government. A long-term plan to say we can grow the regions of New Zealand to deliver jobs. We know there's huge pressure on Auckland housing, and Nick Smith only makes the problem worse. He puts the pressure on. But if we want and we expect people to go and live in the regions of New Zealand, there must be job opportunities there for them. And that will only happen when a government partners up with regional communities. And there is no sign from this government. Instead, Mr Speaker, they're distracted on their own pet priorities. And nothing is a bigger symbol and emblem than that, and it's in the estimates here, the flag. The flag referendum, the $26 million flag referendum says everything you want to know about the priorities of this government. A $28 million social bonds pilot for a project that nobody knows whether it's going to work. That is just a gross ideological experiment. That's another $28 million. This government has its priorities wrong, Mr Speaker. If this government was to introduce a budget to this House that was about investing in the future, supporting opportunities for future generations of New Zealanders, giving them the chance to actually own their own home, then we would be in there supporting it. But that's not the budget that has come to us. And these supplementary estimates are the last gasp of the 2014-15 financial year. A failure of a financial year for this government, a failure to reach surplus, a failure to grow jobs, a failure to invest in the regions who are now have another year of neglect from this government. Mr Speaker, this bill will be opposed by the Labour Party because it is a continuation of this government's failure to deliver to New Zealanders a sound economic plan.